Welcome to my Epic English channel. Subscribe, listen, and enjoy my stories every day. The signs were all there, but I had ignored them, clinging to my trust in Lisa and the life we built. We'd been married 12 years, a solid relationship or so. I thought we had the house, the friends, the inside jokes. It was the kind of marriage where we'd glance at each other from across a room at parties, catching each other's eye like we used to back in college. But then, as life went on, those glances grew less frequent. I chalked it up to stress and work. I'd never thought it would be because of another man. The first time I noticed something was off was last spring. We were driving home after a friend's birthday dinner, a typical evening out. But on the drive back she was oddly quiet, gazing out the window lost in thought. I asked her if something was bothering her, and she just smiled a bit too quickly, patting my arm. "Oh, it's nothing, just work stuff," she'd said, brushing it off. I didn't press her. She wasn't usually one to keep secrets, but that night she was different, distant. Then, over the next few months, her work nights grew more frequent. Late meetings, she would say, it became a pattern. I'd cook dinner, make something nice, set the table, and wait for her call or text. Each time I'd get a brief apology about staying late or having to go meet a new client. She worked in event planning, so it wasn't unusual for her hours to be unpredictable. But the excuses began to stack up, and each one felt thinner than the last. The tipping point came one Friday evening. I was getting some things out of her car. One of the benefits was cars, and she knew I'd been planning to get an oil change done for her. But when I popped open the glove compartment, there was a receipt inside folded into the corner. I knew Lisa well enough to know she wasn't in the habit of leaving clutter around. She was meticulous about keeping things in order. The receipt was from a high-end restaurant across town, one we'd been to together only once on a special anniversary. Yet here was a bill for a dinner, 2 entrees, 2 drinks, and a dessert. My stomach tightened as I checked the date. It was from last week, the night she told me she was working late with her boss to finalize details for a big gala. I wasn't proud of what I did next. I went through her car that evening like a man possessed, checking every compartment, flipping down the visors, looking under the seats. But I didn't find anything else suspicious, just that one slip of paper which told me enough. Still, I didn't confront her, not yet. Instead, I started observing. I began to notice the subtle shifts in her behavior, the way she'd quickly slip her phone back into her bag when I walked into a room, or the extra time she'd spend in the bathroom, getting ready for bed with her phone by her side. After weeks of keeping my suspicions bottled up, I couldn't take it anymore, so I finally did what every man hopes he'll never have to do. I set out to confirm my worst fears. One night after she went to bed, I opened her laptop. Lisa and I shared our passwords. In fact, we had set them together. When we bought our devices, it felt wrong, intrusive, but I told myself that I needed answers. I wanted proof before I confronted her. It wasn't an easy decision. At first everything looked normal, but then I saw an unfamiliar name, Michael, a text thread on her screen. I started scrolling through the messages, heart pounding. Most of them were innocent at first, mentioning work events, shared contacts in the industry, things that could pass as normal, even professional. But the messages grew more personal. There were inside jokes, a couple of late-night exchanges, even a missing you already text. 1,000 thoughts stormed through my head. Had it really come to this? Had she been lying to my face every time she said she was working late? The worst part was I didn't feel angry. I just felt numb. Over the next few days, I became a different man. I watched her like a stranger, every word and action under a microscope, the smallest gestures, a glance down at her phone, a new shade of lipstick she'd never worn before. A sigh as she turned over in bed became suspect. I wanted to confront her, to scream and shout and let it all out, but I kept quiet. Instead, I plotted my next moves carefully. I wasn't going to let her know. I knew not yet. 2 weeks later, she told me about her upcoming work trip. It was an annual conference in another city, a weekend she'd been attending for years. I'd always trusted her, so it never occurred to me to be suspicious about these trips. But this time, with my newfound knowledge, I felt the familiar cold pit in my stomach. She seemed a little too eager about the conference. Her voice just a bit too high-pitched as she told me she'd be leaving on Friday and returning late Sunday night. That night, as she packed her things, I watched her with a detached curiosity. She'd been lying to me for who knows how long, and here she was, coming quietly to herself as she zipped up her suitcase. She even asked if I needed anything from the city, and I played along, smiling, trying not to let my anger seep through. It felt like we were actors, each of us sticking to a script, pretending everything was fine. The next morning I watched her drive off, the last view of her taillights fading down the street. The house felt empty, hollow. I knew I couldn't take it any longer. The first thing I did, after Lisa left, was pour myself a stiff drink. As the liquor burned its way down, I took a deep breath and let the reality of what I was about to do settle in. For the last 12 years I had built a life around this woman, shared secrets, dreams, and sacrifices. But today, all of that was fuel to the fire of betrayal. Simmering inside me, there was no turning back. I didn't want to confront her without something concrete, something I could hold in my hand and look at later when she tried to deny it. So I decided to check her credit card statements. Lisa and I kept a shared account for most things, but she had her own card for work expenses. When I logged in to check the transactions, a pattern jumped out at me: charges to fancy restaurants, bars, hotels, and even a few clothing boutiques purchases. She'd never mentioned ones that didn't add up, and then there were the hotel bookings. None of them lined up with the conference dates she'd mentioned. Instead, they were spread across the last 6 months, all in our city, but far enough away that she'd need a cover story to be gone overnight. She hadn't just lied to me. She'd lied to my face time and again, while I'd been oblivious, holding down the fort, trusting her blindly that night. I barely slept. I kept seeing that damn receipt replaying every word she'd ever said about her so-called late nights, all the excuses she'd thrown at me, thinking she was clever enough to keep me in the dark. A few hours before dawn, I gave up trying to sleep, got up and went to her laptop again. This time I checked her emails, and there it was, email after email exchanged with him. Michael, it wasn't even a fake name, which I realized made it worse. She hadn't bothered with any effort to hide him. The guy was a colleague from another firm, the same man whose name I'd seen on her laptop weeks ago. Their emails were filled with small talk, plans for lunch meetings, and Project One, where she told him, "I can't wait to get away this weekend." I had my answer. She wasn't going to a conference. She was going to meet him in my head. I knew I should feel furious, that I should storm into their hotel and blow up her little fantasy in person, but it felt empty. I didn't want a dramatic showdown. I wanted her to feel the betrayal. I'd felt quietly over weeks, as the truth sank in and poisoned everything. So I started making arrangements. I'd leave her in a way she'd never expect, with no scene, no confrontation, just the silent aftermath of a life imploding. In her absence, she'd come home to find the life she thought she'd controlled had slipped right out of her grasp. On Saturday morning, I called a moving company and arranged for them to come over the next day. My heart raced as I went through the house, picking out my essentials, sorting my things from hers. It was oddly methodical, cathartic even. I didn't need a lot, just my clothes, some keepsakes, my books, and thought the life she loved so much lying there in perfect order, untouched and oblivious to the storm brewing. Before the movers arrived, I went to the bank to finalize everything. I'd moved half of our shared savings to my account, leaving her with a respectable sum, but nothing close to what she thought she'd be coming home to. I canceled the credit card that was in both our names and removed my name from the utilities and mortgage. I had no intention of paying another cent toward a house that would hold nothing but memories of betrayal. Once everything was set, I took one last walk through the empty house, running my fingers over the familiar walls, the photos we'd framed together, the spaces that once felt warm and comforting. I took down the picture of us from our anniversary last year. The one where we'd stood on the beach, arms wrapped around each other, laughing like we had nothing to hide. I stuffed it into my bag without a second glance. That afternoon, after the movers left, I sat in the silence of my new apartment. It was a modest place, but it felt right. No shared history, no shadow of her voice lingering in the hallways, just a blank slate, and it felt like breathing fresh air. After weeks of being trapped for the first time in what felt like ages, I was alone but at peace. I ordered takeout and sat cross-legged on the living room floor, staring out the window at the city lights, feeling a sense of finality settle over me. Then I wrote the letter. It was short and to the point. I didn't want to leave room for argument or negotiation. I wanted her to know that I knew everything, that her lies and betrayals had done irreparable damage, and that our marriage was over. I made it clear that I'd removed myself from every part of our shared life, and that I wasn't coming back. At the end of the letter, I left her with the name and contact information of a divorce attorney I'd already spoken to. All she had to do was sign. I left the letter on the entryway table, the same place where she always left her keys and mail, knowing it would be the first thing she'd see when she walked in. Then I walked out the door without looking back. By Sunday evening, I was settled into the routine of my new apartment. I'd stacked my boxes, neatly unpacked a few essentials, and hung some clothes in the closet. It was quiet, almost too quiet, and in the stillness I wondered what Lisa would be doing right now, halfway through her work trip. Was she with him sharing dinner, laughter, whatever they built on the ashes of our life together? Or was she blissfully unaware, thinking she'd get away with it? All the anger bubbled up and I clenched my fists, forcing myself to let go. I knew I didn't want her back, didn't want a conversation or some explanation. I'd only half believe I wanted her to come home to an empty house, and let that be the loudest response possible to her betrayal. I had no intention of making things easier for her. This was her mess to reckon with, her consequence to face, and there was a strange satisfaction in knowing she'd come home expecting everything to be exactly where she left it. She'd picture the smile on my face when she walked in, maybe even the same old hug. Instead, she'd find a ghost of the life we'd shared in a letter I knew would say more than any argument ever could. The hours ticked by slowly, and as night fell, I thought about all the times I'd stayed up waiting for her to come home, believing her excuses, telling myself she was just working late and that I was being paranoid, how wrong I'd been. But maybe that was what hurt most. I believed in her, trusted her with everything I had, only to find it all shattered on the floor like glass. By Monday morning I was already at work when I knew she'd be coming home. I pictured her entering the house, pausing in confusion as she took in the empty spaces, the missing things, the silence. I imagined her seeing the letter. Part of me wanted to know how she'd react, but another part knew it didn't matter. Her reaction wouldn't change a thing. Just after noon my phone buzzed, and I looked down to see her name on the screen. I could feel my heart racing as I stared at it, debating whether to answer. I let it ring until it went to voicemail, and a moment later she called again. Then a third time I silenced the phone, turning it face down on my desk. Whatever she wanted to say, it would have to wait. I wasn't ready to hear her lies or her apologies, or her frantic attempts to explain. None of it mattered. Now the calls kept coming, each one like a reminder of the years we'd shared, the trust I'd given her, all the sacrifices I'd made for us. The phone stopped ringing, but a new notification appeared, a voicemail. Then another after the sixth one. I grabbed my phone and left the office, stepping outside into the fresh air to clear my head. Against my better judgment, I clicked play on the first message. Daniel, please. I need to talk to you. I don't understand what's going on. Call me back, please. I need to see you. Her voice was shaky, panicked, and I could hear the in her she wasn't prepared for this. She thought I'd leave her. Never imagined she'd lose control of the narrative she'd crafted so carefully. I listened to another message. Daniel, I'm home. Where are you? The house is empty. I don't understand. Why, please just call me. Let's talk. I could hear her voice break, and for a fleeting moment I felt a twinge of sympathy, a stab of the love I'd once felt. But it was buried now under layers of hurt and anger and betrayal. Whatever Lisa was feeling, she'd brought it on herself. After a few deep breaths, I headed back inside, determined to ignore the rest of the messages. But by the time I left work, she'd sent texts too frantic and desperate. I read the first one. Daniel, please. I don't know what happened, but we can work through this. Whatever it is, we'll fix it. I love you. I swear I'll do anything to make this right. Just talk to me. The messages that followed were all variations of the same theme, pleading, bargaining, promising to change. I knew she was grasping at straws, trying to hold onto the life that was slipping through her fingers. But this wasn't something she could fix with promises or empty apologies. When I got back to my apartment that evening, I sat on the couch, staring at her messages, wondering if I should call her back or let her stew in the mess she'd made. I thought about the memories, the years we'd spent together, the laughter, the trips, the life we'd built. It was all ruined, now poisoned by her lies. Finally, I sent a single text. I know about Michael. I know about everything we're done. The response was almost immediate. Please, Daniel, I can explain. I was just lost, confused. It didn't mean anything. It was a mistake. I swear I'll make it up to you. I didn't reply, letting her words linger in the silence. She didn't deserve my forgiveness. She'd had her chance, and she'd thrown it away for a fling, a moment of thrill that shattered our lives. Over the next few days, the texts kept coming, each one more desperate than the last. She tried every angle, had been caught up in a moment, and never thought it would end like this. Her attempts to justify herself only deepened the wound, making it clear that she didn't understand the depth of her betrayal. She couldn't see past her own actions to realize what she destroyed. Then, the anger started to come through in her texts. I can't believe you'd do this to me. Daniel, after all we've been through, after everything I've done for us, you can't just throw this away over one mistake. But her anger was like smoke, thin and insubstantial. There was nothing left for her to cling to, no foundation under the life she'd wrecked. She'd made her choice, and she would have to live with it. Finally, one last message came, the one that I've been expecting all along. Fine. If this is how it's going to be, then let's make it official. I'll sign the papers. I hope you're happy. I put down my phone, a sense of relief washing over me. She'd finally accepted it, finally come to terms with the consequences of her actions. I'd already filed the papers, and now all that was left was for her to sign and set us both free. In the end, there was no satisfaction in her defeat, no joy in the unraveling of her carefully crafted fadi. I felt only a quiet peace, a sense of closure that came from knowing I'd done what needed to be done. A month passed, the paperwork was signed, the final steps taken, and our marriage was officially over. I thought I'd feel a sense of liberation, that I'd step into my new life with confidence, finally free of the hurt that had shadowed me. But instead there was an emptiness, a hollow ache that seemed to echo through the corners of my apartment each night. I kept waiting for that feeling of closure to sink in, but it remained elusive. I'd left her with the house, figuring it was best not to cling to a place so full of memories, so many of which now felt poisoned. She'd sent one last text, cold and abrupt asterisk. Goodbye, Daniel. I hope you get what you wanted. I didn't respond the less. I thought about her the better, and I tried to bury myself in my work and routine. But Lisa was like a shadow lingering at the edge of everything. One Saturday afternoon I got a call from an unknown number. I didn't recognize the voice on the other end until she said her name. "This is Nancy, Lisa's mother." She hesitated, as if searching for the words. "I know you don't owe me a thing, Daniel," but her voice broke a harsh breath, catching on the line. "Could you come to the house?" She didn't explain, but there was something in her voice, something pleading, as if there was no one else in the world she could turn to. Against my better judgment, I agreed, finding myself driving the familiar roads to the house I had once called home, the trees lining the street, the driveway, even the sound of the gravel under my tires. It all brought back a flood of memories. When I arrived, the front door was slightly ajar, a chill of silence filling the air as I stepped inside. Nancy met me in the entryway, her face worn and tired, and I could see been thanked for coming, then led me down the hallway without another word. At the end of the hall, the door to our bedroom was open. Inside the room was dark, curtains drawn, the only light coming from the small bedside lamp, and there sitting on the bed was Lisa. She was a shadow of the woman I'd known, her face pale, hollowed, eyes rimmed red. When she looked up, it was as if she were seeing a ghost. Her voice was faint, fragile. Daniel, her voice was barely a whisper. "You didn't have to come." Nancy stayed by the door, her eyes heavy with sorrow, and I took a step forward, not knowing what to say, what to feel. There was anger buried deep in me, but there was also a pang of pity, something that reminded me of who we once were, the life we had tried to build together. I thought I'd lost everything before she murmured, her eyes glazed, looking past me into memories that only she could see. But I had no idea what real loss was. She swallowed, struggling to gather her words. I didn't interrupt. I simply stood there waiting. "I lost my job last week," she said quietly. "It turns out they knew about Michael. They don't tolerate relationships like that, not when it's that obvious." Her words hung in the air, and I felt a twist in my chest, the final bitter irony of it all. I'd left her to pick up the pieces of her own life, and now those pieces had crumbled beneath her hands after you left it all just unraveled. She continued, her voice small. "I thought I could keep it together, that I could move on without you. But I didn't realize how much of my life was you." I had to look away. There was an emptiness in her voice that felt too raw, too vulnerable. The part of me that wanted revenge had long since faded, leaving only this cold, desolate sorrow that now stretched between us like an unbridgeable chasm. "I didn't think you'd ever leave," she whispered. I thought you'd stay no matter what. And when you left, she faltered her words, catching I was wrong. About everything." Nancy shifted uneasily by the door, and I could see the worry etched into her face. She looked at me as if hoping I'd know what to do, how to make this right. But there was nothing I could say. The time for explanations, for apologies and remorse had passed. I didn't owe Lisa anything anymore. Yet here we were bound together by the shreds of a love that had been twisted beyond recognition. Finally, I forced myself to speak, the words coming out hoarse, barely audible. "You didn't have to throw it all away. Lisa, you didn't have to do this." She nodded, her head bowed, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I know," she whispered, and I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I wanted to tell her I'd forgiven her, that I wished her well, that maybe one day she'd find peace, but the words felt hollow. I knew that leaving her had been my only way to save myself, yet now standing here, I felt the weight of her sorrow, as if it were my own, as if by walking away, I'd left a part of myself behind, a part that could never be reclaimed. There was nothing more to say, no way to rewrite what was already broken. I turned to go, giving Nancy a nod. As I passed her in the doorway, she put a hand on my shoulder, and I could feel her silent gratitude, a mother's desperate wish that somehow her daughter's mistakes would be forgiven. When I stepped outside, the sky was overcast, heavy clouds hanging low over the neighborhood. I walked down the driveway, feeling the weight of that house, that life pressing down on me. When I reached my car, I paused, glancing back one last time at the house that had once been filled with laughter, now cast in shadow. Then I noticed a figure by the window. Lisa watching me. Her face was a blur behind the glass, a faint outline of someone I'd once loved but could no longer reach. I turned away, climbed into my car, and drove off, leaving behind the last traces of a life that was no longer mine. As I reached the edge of town, rain began to fall, soft at first, then steadily washing the streets clean. But no amount of rain could cleanse the sorrow that lingered in my heart, the quiet ache that would follow me for years to come, a reminder of the love we had lost, the life we had shattered. And I realized as the rain blurred the world around me, that in leaving Lisa I had lost a part of myself too, a part that no amount of distance could ever truly erase.